Today we have Dr. Raphael Nishimura with us. He is the Director of Sampling Operations in Survey Research Operations at the University of Michigan. He has a background in statistics and he holds a PhD in survey methodology from the University of Michigan, and he's originally from Brazil. Having already spoken to Professor Lepkowski from the University of Michigan, ISR, today we will ask Dr. Nishimura mostly questions about his consultancy experience to various surveys in Brazil regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has become a major obstacle against face-to-face interviewing around the world, and we had a chance to see different parts of the world coping with different challenges in terms of surveys, as well as different types of surveys coping with different challenges. So Dr. Nishimura, to start us off, as you mentioned in the webinar by the University of Mannheim in April, surveys relying on face-to-face mode were interrupted due to the pandemic, and this had different implications for panel studies versus cross-sectional studies. Could you elaborate on the effect of the pandemic on surveys in terms of this distinction of panel versus cross-sectional studies?
Yeah, sure. So here's the point where maybe my experience in Brazil might not be as relevant, and maybe I will touch base a little bit with my experience here at the Survey Research Center in the University of Michigan. And that's mostly because in Brazil, I don't really have any ongoing panel study happening there. So one of the things that we definitely had in terms of difference between panel studies and cross-sectional studies that were affected by the pandemic was really on how we contact the respondents, right? So in our panel studies, because so the ones that we conduct here at the University of Michigan, because we already have a relationship established with the panel respondents, we have several ways to contact them to conduct the surveys, right? So in some of the panels we conduct here, where we typically would have a face-to-face interview, because of the pandemic, we had to put on hold those efforts, but we were able to transfer that mode of that data collection to another mode. So for two of our big panel studies, we went from a face-to-face to either a web component or a telephone interview. And for the panels, that was relatively straightforward because either with those panel respondents, we have already conducted interviews on those kind of modes. And so the respondents were somehow already used to that sort of approach. Or even those that we have not done that previously, we at least have other ways to contact them, either a telephone number or email address that it really helped us into obtaining responses for those cases. With cross-sectional studies, on the other hand, we don't really have, right, like other means to contact other than like the main mode of data collection for those studies. Here in the US, my experiences has only been with recently with cross-sectional studies, a monthly survey that we conduct about household expenditures and behavior of consumers. And that is a telephone survey. So that really wasn't so much affected by the pandemic, at least like in terms of like obtaining the sample and contacting the sample there. And we also have a project in the field that started a few months ago, just right in the midst of the pandemic. There was a push web a survey, a cross-sectional survey, and on that one we did have some delays on the start of the production of the survey, just because with staff having to not being able to go to the office for a while to prepare the materials, like the mail materials. Also, like we have some delays, like because of like how things are working with mailing these days as well. But we were able to successfully launch that survey. And but again, right, like we are first contacting these respondents for the first time, and contact rates compared to our panel studies are relatively lower. Now, one interesting thing that we did find, we were recently analyzing that, was that on the cross-sectional study, especially like the telephone survey that I was referring before, we have been observing since the beginning of the pandemic a slightly higher contact rate compared to like previous months, compared to like say like last year. There are some, and apparently there are other survey research centers have been observing the same kind of pattern, at least here in the US, maybe more broadly in the world. There are some hypotheses for that. Maybe like at least at the beginning of the pandemic, people were stuck at home, like because of quarantines, lockdowns. So they were more likely to answer the phone, even though they didn't quite recognize the number. But interestingly, we actually saw also an increase in refusal rates. So at the end, when you account for contact rates and and refusal rates, the overall response rate kind of like was pretty much the same, like stable compared to previous months. So this kind of like tell us that even though people are maybe answering their phones on cold calls more often, or they're more likely to answer those who were going to refuse the survey, they're still refusing. Like, so probably those would be people who wouldn't answer the phone anyway, and they're refusing. But now at least we're getting like some content and some idea of like what's the level of eligibility in terms of phone numbers. But on the other hand, we didn't quite see the same like increasing contact rates with our panel studies. With our panel studies, actually, we either saw the same level of contact rate that we had on previous waves of the panels since the pandemic started, or in a few cases, we even saw like a slight reduction of contact rate. Interestingly, we're still not quite sure why that's the case, but that's something that we observed, like when comparing panel studies and cross-sectional studies. I don't know if you want me to say anything else on that, or if you have any other questions on that.
That was a great response for us. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Professor Turkulmaz.
Let me continue. So I have a question before we start to specific questions regarding the surveys in Brazil. Can you give us a main idea of what the predominant survey modes are in Brazil? Does Brazil have established data collection through telephones or online panels? Is face-to-face still popular as of pre-COVID times, I mean, or is it limited to specific types of surveys like health surveys or any other surveys?
Sure. So even though I'm from Brazil, I really haven't like worked on my day-to-day as a day-to-day work job in Brazil for about 10 years. So part of my answer might be a little bit based on that, but I still have like contacts, I still have like colleagues working there, and as far as I know, still to this day in Brazil, the most popular mode of data collection is face-to-face. So most of like public opinion surveys, election polls, health surveys, they are conducted face-to-face in Brazil. But there has been over the past maybe 4 or 6 years a slight like increase on telephone surveys, mostly in political and election polling. There has been like some increase in that end. Well, I guess that marketing research, like surveys for marketing research, they have been exploring a lot. Like, and that's the case, I think, not only in Brazil, but like in many other countries, they have been exploring a lot. Web surveys, non-probability convenience sample surveys, but in a realm of more like public opinion, health surveys, and official statistics, like face-to-face is still definitely the main mode of data collection, even before the pandemic, of course. Online panels, there are, as far as I know, again, like I'm not extremely familiar of the current state of things in Brazil, but as far as I know, there are at least, I would say, that I know of a couple of online panels. There is one from someone that I know that he's been trying to replicate online panel that's been proven quite successfully, I think, here in the US and the UK. If you've heard of like the YouGov web panels like that, I know someone over there that's replicating something very similar. I think I've heard they have like over 100,000 panel respondents that they've been collecting data over the past 4 or 5 years. But of course, and I know that we're gonna talk about that in a second, since the pandemic, there has been like a spike on the interest of telephone surveys in Brazil. I've been like doing some work on that. And interestingly, like maybe another thing to point out, even the official statistics agency in Brazil, IBGE, they conduct primarily most of their surveys and the census face-to-face. In fact, the census in Brazil, just like here in the US, it happens in every year ending in 0. So it was supposed to happen this year. And whereas here in the US, they're still collecting and conducting the census, which is via mail and web. In Brazil, they were planning to do that face-to-face, but because of the pandemic, they actually postponed the census for 2021. So it was supposed to happen this year. Now, because of the pandemic, it's going to happen next year. And I'm mentioning the IBGE, the Official Statistics Institute in Brazil, because, believe it or not, they don't have almost any experience with telephone surveys. We're going to talk a little bit about that, I believe, next. And they had to transition some of their important monthly and why not like surveys to telephone. They had to like get some help in that because they really didn't have any in-house expertise with telephone sampling or telephone surveys, and they had to transition that pretty quickly in order to be able to continue their data collection effort. And I think that they were actually quite successful. Like they have right now, at least, as far as I know, at least 2 or maybe 3 studies in the field conducting by phone that previously were face-to-face, or at least 2 of those were face-to-face. And they seem to at least be having some success in that transition.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to ask a question on a survey you mentioned in the University of Mannheim as well. The demographic consequences of the Zika epidemic, which was initially designed to be a household survey in Brazil. So the question is, how did the pandemic affect this survey? Can you share the experience with respect to the mode switch in the survey? And meaning also, how has the sampling design been affected? Did you miss any data in alternative modes that you would be able to collect through face-to-face?
Yeah, exactly. So that was definitely that was like one of the 2 projects that I've been involved in Brazil recently. So the Decode Zika, or demographic consequence of the Zika epidemic, and so I'm going to try to tell a quick background and story of this project. So I started working with them last year, so way before we knew this all was going to happen. This is a study that the target population is not the entire country, is only like a very specific area in Brazil, is in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco. In fact, it's not even like on the entire state, it's only on the metropolitan region, one of the largest metropolitan region of the state, metropolitan region of Recife, and another couple of regions, Mata e Agreste. And they, as the name suggests, they were interested in studying the consequences of Zika. So their target population actually was women between the ages of 18 to 34 years old in that area in Brazil. So since the very beginning, since the concept of the study, you're planning on conducting face-to-face household survey. Face-to-face because that has, like in Brazil at least, the best coverage properties, like it doesn't have any sort of other coverage. And they have a grant to be able to do that work. So at the end of last year, we actually selected so it was supposed to be an area probability sampling. So a first stage of, in the first stage of this sample design, we selected a sample of municipalities in Brazil, like cities. And then within those municipalities, we selected a sample of what we call in Brazil enumeration areas, or actually we call it how do you call it, as census sectors. And the idea was to, once we selected those census tracts, we would send field enumerators to those. They would list all the households in those census tracts, and from those lists, we would select a probability sample of households, right? And we were doing that. We selected a sample of municipalities. We selected a sample of census tracts. We sent the field enumerators to do the household listing. They actually did the household listing in all the census tracts, and that was back in February when they finished the household enumeration. Then the pandemic came, and they were about to start. They were like literally, I think, 1 or 2 weeks to start the main interview data collection. We still haven't quite selected the sample of households, but we had all the household listing done. When they had to put a hold on that effort because of the pandemic. And so they really didn't know exactly where to go with the project, because we didn't have like an idea of when how long this pandemic would take. So after, I think, a couple of weeks, when they realized that they wouldn't be allowed to go back into the field, like, or at least on the foreseeable future, they decided to do transition on their survey. So they decided to go to a telephone survey. After, like, first we took a look at what was the coverage of telephones in Brazil, and specifically on that area. And I think historically in Brazil, by the way, I should say, telephone sampling or telephone survey was not that common or popular up until now, I guess, right? Because historically, like at least up until maybe 10 years or so ago, telephone penetration in Brazil hasn't been like that high. But as we experienced, like I think in pretty much most of places in the world, because of cell phones, telephone penetration started like really increasing, like over the past 10 years, to a point that I think, if I remember correctly, in Brazil, we have an average of it's above 90% telephone penetration, 95%. And from those, most of them, the vast majority is because of cell phones. Like there is, I think, just a very small percentage of people that only have access to a landline. Most of people have at least access to a cell phone, some of those cell phone and a landline. So the project team did like some analysis to determine what was the telephone penetration first in that area in Brazil where they were studying, especially also among women between 18 to 34 years old. They actually found out that 95% of those women had a cell phone number. So with that, we still would have like an under coverage of about like those 5% of the population, but it seems to the principal investigators good enough to transition that coverage, to transition to a telephone mode. So that's what we did. And we then had to select a sample all over again for that study. This time with random digit dialing methodology, RDD. They had to change a little bit the target population because in Brazil, we have area codes, just like in many countries. And while it would be possible to select telephone numbers on a very similar area that they were targeting, it wouldn't be perfect. Like we wouldn't be able to really cover the exact same municipalities. Like they have a list actually of municipalities that they were interested in. So they slightly changed the target population to cover a little bit more than they were initially covering, so that like we can really select telephone numbers based on area code on that area in the country. We had to, throughout the data collection, we also had to make some changes, but at the beginning they had to drastically reduce the questionnaire, and I know that that's probably like a question that was that's coming up. But they for this project, it was, I think when it was a face-to-face data collection, it was an interview that would take over, I think, an hour, and they reduced down to, I think, about 20 to 25 minutes questionnaire. Because of the pandemic, because of the COVID pandemic, they also took the opportunity to also add some questions about COVID in the questionnaire, which is interesting for this project because Brazil had just been through like this Zika kind of like pandemic a couple of years ago, and now we are getting to this other pandemic. So they are also really interested in understanding the relationships with especially in behavior of Zika, and now with COVID, even though like they do have different vulnerable populations, right? Like Zika, they are more interested in like the impact on pregnant women, but they also are interested in like what's the consequences in like on behavior of women, young women, women like in age that reproductively age of the COVID pandemic. And what else? So anyhow, this was a face-to-face, RDD telephone survey. We selected a sample of telephone numbers. There was actually another challenge because even though I said in Brazil, there has been some increased interest in telephone surveys, the RDD methodology is not as common as it is here in the US, at least. So just implementing that RDD methodology, working with the survey company, the local survey company there, was already another challenge. We had to tell them, well, like we can't really, like the survey providers, the local survey providers said, well, we have a list of telephone numbers. We had to explain that we can't really only use that. Like we could use that as some sort of like a supplement, but we can't only use that because that also have some serious coverage issues. I had to explain that even with the RDD, we actually use like a modification of RDD to improve the efficiency, a list assisted RDD. And even with that, the hit rate was very low. The hit rate of like successful residential working telephone numbers. I think like for every one successful telephone number, they had to call like 100 numbers. But they have an auto dialer, but even that auto dialer had a certain capacity of like how much they can call. So we had to also work through different ways to try to improve the efficiency of the sample for them, so that like they could collect the sample, the target sample size that they had within like the survey period that they were trying. And actually, I should say that's something that I couldn't have said back in my presentation in Mannheim, but just as of last week, they finished data collection of that project. So they collected, I think, about 4,000 interviews there. And now we're gonna get into like the weighting of the sample. This will be somehow a longitudinal study. So they also collected information from the respondents, like telephone information, not telephone, but like other telephone contact information, address as well, email address, because they want to follow for, I think, at least a year, those respondents. And they're actually doing some interesting experiments on how to contact those, how to keep them engaged, so that they don't have like such high attrition rate throughout the study period. So they're gonna use things like, they're using already actually, things like WhatsApp, text messaging, email messages as well. So this is still an ongoing project, even though they at least collected that baseline survey. And did I miss any data in alternative modes that would, yeah. So, I mean, as I said, they had to reduce the questionnaire quite a lot. So there's for sure like they're not being able to collect as much information as they would like through a face-to-face survey. But as far as I remember, I don't think they didn't have any biospecimen data collection. So at least on that sense, nothing was really not able to be collected. But they did have to reduce the questionnaire quite considerably in order to conduct this survey through telephone as successfully at least as a face-to-face.
Thank you. I have a minor follow-up question on this. So you said the survey was originally designed for northeastern part of Brazil, right? So what if you called a mobile phone number and the person you reached actually now lives in the very south? Was that person excluded because of geographic definition, or how was that dealt with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I mean, even though, right, like we were able to target the sample to that area, local for area code. There's portability, right? And yeah, so no, there is at the very beginning of the survey, they do some sort of screening, because again, it's not only they are screening actually respondents because they are looking only for women between 18 to 34 years old on that area. So the geography was also definitely a screening criteria. And so if they called someone, if it's a woman, even if it's a woman between 18 to 34 years old, but it's not on that specific area, and they actually have a list of municipalities on that area code. If they're not on that list of municipalities, even if they are on northeast of Brazil, and not even on the same state, but in another city that's not on the target area, they screened out. Maybe I should say also just another thing. I mentioned that one of the things that throughout that collection, we had to make some tweaks on the sample design, because it was getting really hard for the survey company to collect, to get respondents for the survey. So one of the tweaks that we made, which I thought was quite interesting, was, again, we were targeting women 18 to 34 years old on that area, right? So and we're treating cell phone as a personal device. So whoever answered the phone was the person that, like, we're assuming was the owner of the cell phone and who was the selected respondent, right? But as I said, the survey company was having a hard time getting respondents. So one of the tweaks we made was if we called a number that was a male, but that male was married or lived together, like had a stable relationship with a woman from 18 to 34 years old on that area, we would recruit that woman through that male. We also looked at we also thought about other more small tweaks, like what if like we call a woman on that area, but is outside the age range, but she's the daughter or the mother of another woman on that area within that age range. And for that particular case, we decided not to pursue, just because of like how weighting the sample would be, like if we were to do that. Like we thought it was easier to do that with males that are married or in a stable relationship than like with other kinds of like relationship. And in fact, apparently from what I've heard, there was like a big factor to really push through the second half of data collection, the project to get like as many respondents as they needed.
So we are also wondering on another household survey you mentioned, the continuous national household sample survey in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
With the onset of the pandemic, you were involved in the design of a new telephone survey whose frame was based in a former wave of the household survey. So the questions are, was there any coverage issue regarding phone ownership? What about the response rates? And were there any modifications to the survey instruments, such as shortening the questionnaire? Thank you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yeah, this was back, I think, in April or May. I was contacted by some folks at the Official Statistics Office in Brazil, IBGE, saying that because of the pandemic, they had to put on hold all their face-to-face effort, and they were looking at alternatives for their data collection, especially telephone surveys, and they don't have any in-house experience with telephone sampling and telephone survey methodologies. So they were looking for some people to help them to design and think about how to do that. And so what happened was they have this continuous survey, as you mentioned, right? Like this extremely large national household sample survey that they are continuously collecting. They're always in the field with that. They release results typically for that survey every quarter and every year. So they have quarterly results, yearly results, and that actually collects like one of the most important, I think, indicators, labor force. It's kind of like part of like the labor force survey so they really needed to continue collecting that sort of information because the economy was definitely a concern throughout this pandemic, especially like the consequences for labor force. So they kind of like divided this effort into two. On one hand, they're still continuing to collect data through this sample survey, this national house sample survey, but they have been they transitioned that into telephone surveys, and on that effort I wasn't very involved, but what they were doing is they have like a frame of addresses, and they've been working with partners to append telephone numbers to those addresses. Now, obviously, they are not being able to append to all of those households, but it seems that like they had somehow some success. On another front, and that's like where I helped them, they wanted to have like a similar survey to this one, but collecting more information about COVID, but also a little bit about labor force to be kind of like a comparison for their main survey. And so that's why I was brought on to help them to design, to think and design that survey. Initially, they had two options: either select a completely from scratch a fresh sample using some sort of like a RDD sample, or they have been working with the telecommunication authority in Brazil, Anatel, that should like get like a database of all telephone numbers in Brazil, and they could potentially apparently select a sample from that instead of having to use like a RDD per se. But we're also considering as another option using, as you mentioned, as a sample frame, one of the waves, passed wave from this national household sample, which is again like very high quality. It's face-to-face, is an area probability sample, but append to that sample a telephone numbers, similar to what they were doing to the other survey, and contact those households to do some sort of a panel. So they have like only with this one wave, which is kind of like corresponds, as far as I understand, to a quarter of the year. They appended telephone numbers to those, and they built kind of like a panel, so that like they divided the sample into 4 subsamples, so that in a month, each week they would have like a quarter of the sample, and they like collect that like throughout like while the pandemic at least is going on. And if as far as I know, they're still collecting data from that sample. Now, so they obviously couldn't use the same kind of instrument that they're using on the other survey. They wanted to also ask information about COVID. So they worked on a fairly reduced questionnaire that would take, I think, about 15 to 20 minutes. They collect information about labor force, but also collection information about COVID. And the interesting thing, and that's what I think is one of the strongest points of this survey, right? Because they already have data from this baseline, let's call it baseline sample, this previous wave, they can do all sort of like analysis and statistical adjustments on the sample that they are currently collecting, right? So one of the things that we can definitely do is like an analysis of like what percentage of the sample we're not able to append a telephone number, and what's the differences of that sample to the cases that they were able to append a telephone number. So in that end, they were quite successful in getting a telephone number matched to the sample. If I remember correctly, it's about 93% of the cases, and there was a sample of size over 200,000 households. And they were able to append 93% of the households a telephone number. Of course, that not every telephone number is a correct number. I think that from those, about 75% were correct numbers. But the response rate was actually surprisingly very high for those. I don't quite remember from the top of my head, but like it was, I mean, for a telephone survey at least, which I'm used at least here in the US of response rates on the single digits, their response rate was like above, I think 60%, I want to say, but like probably even higher than that. There's probably like some reasons, like they had like an entire advertisement campaign on the internet and TV to let people know that the Official Statistics Institute was collecting data by phone. There was like a very important thing for the country, so that if people got like a call from an interviewer to collaborate with the survey, they have like pretty much all their, not all, but like most of their face-to-face interviewers were switched to telephones. So like they have like this huge staff of interviewers like calling telephone numbers like every day. So it was considered within like the institution as a big success, a big showcase. And as I said, one of the main advantages, right, like is they have all this data that they collected from the sample. So not only they can do this analysis of like non-response analysis, coverage analysis, but they can also make statistical adjustments. So weighting adjustments, like if there is any sort of like subpopulation that is underrepresented on this telephone sample, they're able to address that through some sort of weighting, because they have information for the cases that they're not able to append the telephone number, for the cases that they were able to append the telephone number, but it was not quite a correct number. And for the cases that they were able to call, it is a quite right number, but they turn out to be non-respondents. They have information for all of those cases that they can use on non-response adjustments. And on top of that, they have underlying a very high quality sample design for this. Like this is, as I said before, it's an area probability sample. So like all the certification, clustering, selection probabilities from that sample design, they can just carry over the sample, because that was the sample that was selected. They're just using that to continue their collection on that sample, like through this kind of like longitudinal or like panel study. And as I said, they have like much more information that we would typically have in a telephone survey, or even like a face-to-face survey, to do those kind of like bias analysis and statistical adjustments. Yeah, I think that I covered most of the questions, I believe.
Can I again interrupt for a minor follow-up question again?
Sure.
So all those properties of area probability sampling could also apply to classical mail surveys, right? Postal surveys. Are those not common in any way in Brazil? I know they're not common in Turkey, and I was wondering if that was the case in Brazil too. And like, if it is the case, I was wondering why that was the case. So that's one question. And the other is, for the two last questions where you mentioned about two specific surveys, we're mentioning telephone interviewing, and are those happening through a centralized CATI system or a decentralized CATI system? Because of the pandemic, like are interviewers just calling in from home?
Yeah, good question. So about the mail, and this is something that I forgot to mention on the first question, the modes of their collection in Brazil. So unlike, at least here in the US, mail surveys in Brazil are almost, as far as I know, not used almost at all. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One, at least historically, literacy rates in Brazil, like even though they're pretty high, I think there's still some concern that it's not high enough to justify that. Second one is like also postal service in Brazil is sometimes not that great and varies a lot throughout the country. So there's also, I think, some concern in like whether having the mail arrive like on the correct place, and like also having that mail back to the survey institution. And then like I think it's just like historically, right? Like people are not used to answer surveys by mail as, for example, they are here in the US. So I think there's also just this other feature that people are just not used. And also, some institutions are kind of like concerned that like if they do something like that, it would be a big waste of time because people will just not answer the surveys. But you're absolutely right that if you were to use mail surveys or some sort of like, it doesn't have to be a mail survey, it could be like a mail push web, which is like very popular these days. You could use some of those properties. I probably wouldn't use the same kind of like design I would use in a area probability sampling, because there isn't so much of a concern in terms of like travel costs that we would have. Like, so I probably wouldn't use as much clustering as we would, but like definitely some certification, like using geography, I would probably use in that sense. And about the CATI, it's decentralized as far as I know. I think think on both projects. I'm sure that for the project with the Official Statistics Institute, it is decentralized CADI, like the interviewers are working from home for obvious reasons. And for the Zika project, I believe so, but like I've actually never talked to them about it, but I believe that that'll be the case because as far as I know, most of CADI work has been done decentralized these days, just because, I mean, you can't have people in the office, locked in the office, on the state of things these days. Which actually raises another interesting concern that we've been having here in the at the Survey Research Center on how to monitor data quality, right? Because in a centralized CADI, right, like you have team leaders, you have project managers, like right there in the floor, monitoring everything that happens. If the interviewers have any questions, they can just like rely on their supervisor, their team leader, to help them in a decentralized form. Like we've been experiencing, like we've been, I think, quite successfully in monitoring data quality through various ways, but it's definitely a less, I mean, by definition, right? Like it's a less, we're not on a very well controlled environment as we would like in a centralized CADI.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shall I continue? Actually, I have a question of, are you aware of any studies in Brazil conducted to estimate the prevalence or seroprevalence of infection? So even the answer is yes or no. If you were to design it, so what would be your recommendations for reaching respondents, and what will be the mode? If honest speaking, I would really answer this question for myself and for my country in my case, but I'm really answering your response for your case.
Yeah, so I am aware of at least one study in Brazil that was conducted to estimate prevalence of COVID. I wasn't involved on that study, so I don't have a lot of details. But what I know, it was like a national sample, national effort. A pretty large sample size. I don't remember which one, or what was the sample size exactly, but it was, I think, over 10,000 respondents at least, but don't quote me on that. I just remember it was like a fairly large sample size. And the reason why I remember that is just because I remember being a quite ambitious study, because not only they were trying to conduct a study like at a national level on this environment, but it was like a large study. And what was most surprising to me, and again, I'm not sure how well it performs, it was a face-to-face study. So they actually sent interviewers to the field for this data collection. Don't ask me how, why, and how, because as I said, I wasn't involved on the study, and I don't know also what was their rate of success in conducting those. But I do know that in Brazil, we had at least like one study that did that. Now, if it was up to me, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what sort of protection devices they had, like to like protect both interviewers and respondents on that study. I want to believe that they had masks, and why not? But I'm not sure how I would conduct, like in which kind of mode I would necessarily conduct this kind of a study like this in Brazil, at least, because on one hand, right, like again, I don't know how successful they were, but you could expect that you wouldn't, on this environment, you wouldn't be as successful as in terms of like response rate, cooperation, as you would like in a pre-COVID era, right? But on the other hand, as I was saying before, in order to make this sort of data collection, right, like you need to do some sort of like biospecimen collection. And at least in Brazil, I'm not sure if like the alternative would be that I can think of, at least a mail data collection, in which like you'd send some sort of kit to the respondents in their home, right? Like I don't know if there'll be a swab or some sort of thing. They do that and then like they mail back. But as I was mentioning before, there are, at least in Brazil, some concerns about like how to do that sort of data collection. Mail, right? Like not only postal service, but also like just historically, the population is not that used to that sort of thing. Probably maybe there could be also some probably privacy and data confidentiality concerns there as well, especially when dealing with biospecimen. So at least in terms of like mode of data collection, I don't think I have any strong recommendations. I don't think that I would even try to do so, because I think that there are pretty strong advantages and disadvantages on either approach. But in terms of like sample design, which is my more area of expertise, I would definitely, if you're spending the effort for doing such a study, I would definitely consider a probability-based design. I wouldn't like consider a non-probability-based method, given the amount of effort that you have to go through this to collect. But now, like what kind of design, it would depend, of course, on the mode of data collection. If it is like face-to-face, as they did here in Brazil, not here, there in Brazil, we'll probably use some sort of area probability-based design with some sort of clustering to, of course, reduce costs, certification, to try to improve estimates. So our typical area probability sampling, I think. If it's a mail survey, as I said before, we wouldn't need necessarily to rely so much on clustering, because we wouldn't have those same cost concerns, but definitely would use some sort of geographical certification there. I should also say, and maybe some people who might be watching this might be thinking about that, like that survey that I was referring before, that the Official Statistics Institute in Brazil are conducting by phone, and they're collecting COVID questions. They're collecting questions about symptoms of COVID, right? But they're very clear when they present the data that that's not, they are not trying to estimate the prevalence based on that. It's just to have like an overall like idea of like what are the symptoms that the population has been experiencing, but like that's by no means that their intention is to use that to estimate prevalence, because we know that like there is like it's really difficult only based on like looking at symptoms to be able to estimate that sort of prevalence. If they were, right, like I think that based on their estimates like of the symptoms, they will probably be like, I think, overestimating the prevalence if they were to use that. So that's definitely also something that I would probably not recommend, right? Like trying to do this kind of study only based on like self-reports, right? Like I think it would be really important, if you're really serious about estimating prevalence, to you're gonna have to do some sort of like biospecimen data collection there. I don't think that relying purely on self-reports is reliable at all. Now, I'm not sure if I was any helpful with my answer, Dr. Turkumas, but
yeah, it is very much. So as a person, I also spent too much time to considering what if I were doing the designing when I had some ideas. Yeah, and also I believe that the timing of the survey or surveys on prevalence is also important, because depending on the period that the country facing, and the how can I say, how the infection is become a widespread across the country or the some sub-regions, I believe that such the surveys should be repeated with some period, because Turkey had experienced a survey kind of a relatively early times with a very low prevalence. I'm not talking about the other issues with the design of the survey and the implementation, but given that, what if we would repeat now, and what if we do this at the end of the year? So I believe that's for such surveys also kind of a reputation, the comparison also important.
Yes, that's a great point. And there was actually another thing that really kind of like shocked me when I saw the survey here in Brazil that they're trying to estimate prevalence rate, because I think that they did I think that the intention is very good, but I was just having a hard time understanding how they're going to operationalize that, because remember I said that there was like it was a pretty large sample, a national sample in Brazil, which is like a continental country, and they were expecting to do that in a very short time frame. I want to say it was something between 1 or 2 weeks of data collection. So like, I cannot think of a survey, a national probability-based sample in Brazil that would be able to be successfully collected without spending a very large amount of resources and money that will be able to collect like within that time frame. But it is very important, right? Because as you mentioned, right, like the pandemic has like has this temporal dimension there, like depending on when you're measuring, you're going to be capturing different things. So like we cannot do as I don't know, doing a lot of error probability samples that we collect the data throughout like 3 or 4 months of data collection, right? Because things can change so radically, as they did actually over the past like 3 to 4 months, that you can be like measuring something that is like completely different. So I completely agree with you that you have to take into account that time dimension, like on this kind of study, even more seriously, or much more seriously than we would typically do, like in most of our surveys.
And I believe that this also raises the question of who will be the interviewers or the data collectors. So in Turkish case, the who collected the data are actually the health personnel who are also doing a affiliation process or the patient tracking process, who already got some preventive, clothes and the tools, also had some experience in order to make the PCR tests. So I believe that not only the sample design, but from the implementation process, the characteristics and the quality and the capacity of the so-called interviewers or the data collectors or the sample collectors is also very critical, given that we have to do it in a very shortened time with a kind of a standardized way of data collection.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. Because like if you, as I was saying before, right, like if you want to collect information in such a short amount of time, right, like you're gonna need also a much larger staff of interviewers than we typically need. And yes, like there is also concerns on like how do you train all of this people on like this type of data collection, for sure.
I guess I can go on with our next question, which is rather a prospective one. Globally speaking, what type of survey errors are going to be mostly referred in the survey realm from today on, with the abandonment or replacement of the face-to-face surveys? What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Haven't thought so much about it, to be honest. I mean, the obvious one, but so the thing is, a lot of the type of errors that like this switch from face-to-face to other modes, right? Like has already happened over the past, like, I don't know, like 20, 30 years, because it is not something that, you know, like it's a really new, right? Like at least here in the US, back in the 60s, 70s, there was like this transition from face-to-face to telephone, and there was like a lot of like research and discussion done on that. Then more recent, then like even within telephones, like it's not really a mode switch, but like we started with landline only, and then like switched to like these dual frames incorporating cell phones, and more recently we've been talking about like cell phone only designs. More recently, over the past like 10 or so years, we've been talking a lot about like transitioning also to web, and more likely mixed mode designs, right? Like where you use like all or like a lot of like combinations of the different types of surveys. So I think that a lot of like the discussion that will be triggered from this is kind of like going back to discussions that we previously had. So like the most obvious one when moving from a face-to-face to a telephone survey is coverage, right? Like, so there's a lot of concern about coverage now, depending on the country that you're talking about. Like if the telephone coverage, telephone penetration is not high enough, there is definitely some serious concerns about like some potential coverage bias, right? Measurement, I think it might be another area that will be triggered a lot, because we know that there is like some mode effects when moving from a face-to-face interview, where like you have like the interview right there in front of you, talking to you, to go into a telephone interview, which a lot of the times, right, like with telephone surveys, we will still be interviewer administered. So you still be talking to another human being, but not having that like visual interaction. There's we know from previous research that it has some effect. So there might be some revisions of like those types of errors. Non-response will never go away, like, and that's a problem on most data collection methods. Although in telephone surveys, it's definitely more pronounced. Like we have lower response rates typically than face-to-face response rates, but I don't think that like the discussion there is really going to be that much different than what we had before. So I'm not really sure like if there is anything necessarily particularly new on like terms of survey error, a discussion on survey errors because of that, but I can. So I don't know, like we have been having like conferences, webinars, talks about like the consequences of the pandemic in survey research. But I'm yet to see, I think, anything really new on any of those discussions, other than, again, like some larger interest in countries that they didn't really have like as a predominant mode of data collection telephones, right? But in a way, the survey research has already been through that. Webs as well, or like mixed mode, web survey or mixed mode, also have seen some more. There's seen more interest in developing countries, in like other countries that haven't used those kind of modes. But again, those discussions at some point, at least before, has already happened, and I think it would just be helpful for like having those sort of discussions now going forward in places that typically they were relying on face-to-face data collection, and now they will have to consider or they had to consider other means of data collection. And going forward, I think that's the interesting thing, right? Like maybe in Brazil, for example, to use the examples that I've been using. In Brazil, going forward, telephone surveys might be considered more often than not than they have been in the past, because of the capacity that was built this past several months to be put into place. that sort of data collection. So I think that maybe that might be a little bit of what's going to be changed in a lot of countries that like previously it might not have been considered, because face-to-face was always the kind of like gold standard default mode that like countries would go.
So our final question to Dr. Nishimura is a hypothetical one. So we wanted to ask you about the long-term effects of the pandemic, basically, and we're asking you through this hypothetical question. So let's assume the pandemic is eradicated overnight. Do you think surveys will go back to the pre-COVID era instantly, or what challenges should we be expected after the disease actually is eradicated?
So, I mean, in a way, in some countries, I feel that we are kind of like experiencing a little bit about of that. Because some countries, what I've seen is that some countries have like either because of infection rates are kind of like as low enough, they have either already went back to face-to-face data collection, or they are starting the process to get back to that. So at least based on what I've seen, it seems that like people are really eager to, you know, like as soon as this is all over, they're kind of like eager to, you know, go back to their bread and butter. Now, if in this hypothetical situation, then my answer would probably be, I think that a lot of institutions would probably go back to how things were done, like face-to-face, if they were done face-to-face. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it would be a good idea. Now, why I'm saying that, I think that like it's important, if anything, right? Like if there is like any silver lining from all of this, it's important to take some lessons from this whole thing. One of those being that while face-to-face data collection, like area probability sampling, is and will probably be and will probably always kind of be the gold standard. That doesn't mean that other modes of data collection are not like, I wouldn't say just as good, but like probably good enough for a lot of the surveys. So while I think that a lot of places will try to, as soon as possible, resume their previously modes of data collection, whether they're face-to-face or not, I think that there will probably be some other institutions, I hope actually, that will think twice, will consider more carefully other alternatives for data collection, whether that is phone, whether that is web, or mail even. I think it's a good kind of like learning, because it really makes people think on like as we were talking before, right? Like on the types of survey errors that is involved in a survey, right? Like now, why do you use typically face-to-face or like area probability sampling? Well, most of it is because of its coverage properties, right? Like it's, as I was saying before, is the gold standard for coverage. As long as you have like a one-to-one correspondence of like geography with your population elements, in theory, you have like 100% coverage. Now, does this mean that telephone survey is much worse than a face-to-face on area probability sample? Not necessarily. It will depend, of course, on like what's the coverage rate, what's the penetration of telephone in your target population. What is the difference between the covered population and covered population? And there might be, we might be introducing some small biases in your estimates because of those. But I think that there's also, it has to have, and I think that people are thinking more about that. There is not only about, us as survey methodologists think a lot about survey errors, but it's not only about survey errors, it's also about survey costs. does the amount of bias, sometimes even negligible amount of bias they're introducing because of these coverage properties, really justifies how much more money you're investing or how much more effort you're investing on a face-to-face data collection that you could be actually collecting through phone. Same thing with web, although I think web, like, it is more pronounced, the difference, like not only in terms of like penetration rates, internet penetration rates, but also differences between the covered and the uncovered populations. I mean, mail we didn't really discuss because I think there are different reasons on different countries, like literacy rate is definitely, I think, an issue there, although it would also be an issue probably on web. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, as I said, to answer the question once again, is I think that surveys could, and I think actually some of people are definitely eager to go back to as they were pre-COVID. But I hope, and it seems that there are some people that will probably not go instantly. They'll probably need to finish their data collections they're doing, like maybe on phone or web. But hopefully they will consider those alternatives going forward. Now, another thing that should be also taken into account, which I didn't say, was about surveys that has some sort of series, right? Like they've been collecting data in the past and are collecting now and will be collecting the future, right? And I've been kind of like involved in a few of those. We have now, they're gonna have, so say that before they had like face-to-face data collection, and now they had to transition to either phone or web. If they haven't been careful enough on that transition, they might see some like differences that are not due true differences. They might be due to what I call mode effect, right? Whether because of measurement or because of response. And so going forward, like they're also going to have to make a decision, right? Like they have this series that they had before the pandemic that, again, if they were not careful enough, was kind of like broken. It's kind of like compromise due to like mode effects. And what to do going forward, right? Like, do they just like ignore this period of time that like they had to mode switch and like go back to the previous mode and like kind of have this kind of like gap in their series, or they maybe start a new series and like continue now the data collection from the series from the mode switch that they did now, or they make adjustments on the statistical adjustments on the data to make the two pieces of the series more comparable. So that's definitely another thing to think about, especially those like involving longitudinal kind like of studies that they have some sort of series. So that doesn't really like, it's part of, I guess, part of the question, but that's one of the challenges that I would expect after the pandemic is eradicated. Like also like longitudinal studies, how to account for that if they didn't really design it, which like I also completely understand, because a lot of projects had to like do that like on the fly. They didn't have enough time to prepare the survey for that sort of switch. So concerns about comparability, like on those kind of studies, you're gonna have to have, and what to do going forward.
I think that was a great point. Making sure if the differences are due to time or due to the mode switch, I think that was a great point to make. If I would like to ask Professor Türk Yılmaz and Yaser if they have any other questions.
Actually, I don't have an extra question, but just some addition, because it will not disappear in one night. So I believe that we have kind of a time for revision of the surveys, or how can I say, improvement of the survey, if this COVID giving us some chance to kind of make an evaluation of what we were doing and what are we doing and what we will do in terms of conducting the household surveys. So, so you already explained your view, but how about the other alternatives like big data? So I don't know, they are not the full alternative, but still, in order to kind of predict, to make prediction and produce data. So this will also a different kind of the chance to see the how we can combine or how we can compare these two alternatives.
Yeah, that's definitely a very hot topic these days in the survey field on how to combine big data with surveys, right? Like, it's interestingly, that's not something that I, for a reason or maybe it's just not part of my own bubble, but there's not something that I really have heard a lot during the pandemic, like as a consequence, like of the pandemic, like how more useful or not, like this alternative sources of data or big data have been, but it's definitely an ongoing, I think, talk in the survey field on how to incorporate that, like how to use that, and it might be a discussion that other groups are having that I'm just not aware of, that because of the pandemic, it became like more pronounced, like this alternative sources of data. Now, the thing is, though, even though I think that more broadly speaking, not so much like talking about the pandemic, but like my views on this is that, like, even though I do recognize that more and more like this sort of like big data and might not like have been somehow, I wouldn't say replacing, but at least like providing as an alternative source of data, where like before surveys were really the only source. I still think there is a role there for surveys. I mean, surveys are like designed data, so you really have more control over like the quality of the data, and it's obviously more expensive to collect, but it requires less effort to analyze. Whereas like with big data, it might be much cheaper to collect, but might require much more effort to analyze and to get proper meaning and like draw proper inferences from that. So like, it's kind of like where do you allocate your resources, right? Like you allocate your resources in the front end through a designed data, like through surveys, and then like at the end, you don't have to spend so much effort like in analyzing the data, because the data is like almost like, you know, like designed for that sort of thing. Or do you put like your resources, you spend your resources on the back end, in which like you collect the data that is kind of like already available, or like it's like been already kind of like generated, but you now need to spend a lot of resources, a lot of effort to model that data, to make adjustments on those data, to really make like meaningful, helpful, and like proper inferences for what you want to for the population that you want to analyze.
Thank you very much. In this case, I would like to start wrapping this up. We thank Dr. Raphael Nishimura a lot for all the time he spent for us and all the insights he gave us. So thank you very much for participating in our discussion. I would like to give the word to Professor Turkilmaz.
Yeah, actually, I just want to repeat my appreciation for his, how can I say, to the very valuable experiences, not only from Brazil, but for also a global view to the what's happening during the COVID to household surveys, but also what may happen after COVID, under the assumption of the COVID will disappear. So, but it is true that we will be experiencing a different or special days, not only in our social life, but also in the social research methodology. So I thank you again. So.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. As you can see, like I love to talk about surveys and about sampling, so always a pleasure. Thanks.